Hello and welcome to the Street Crime UK YouTube channel. Please don't forget to like, share and subscribe. Today we look at the infamous serial killer Harold Shipman, aka the Angel of Death, and how he left a deep, unforgiving imprint on the UK. Harold Frederick Shipman, born on the 14th of January 1946, died on the 13th of January 2004. Known to acquaintances as Fred Shipman, was an English general practitioner who is believed to be one of the most prolific serial killers in modern history. On the 31st of January 2000, Mr. Shipman was found guilty of murdering 15 patients under his care. His total number of victims was approximately 250. Mr. Shipman was sentenced to life imprisonment with the recommendation that he never be released. Mr. Shipman died by suicide, hanging himself in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield, West Yorkshire on the 13th of January 2004, a day before his 58th birthday. The Shipman Inquiry, a 2-year-long investigation of all deaths certified by Mr. Shipman, which Dame Janet Smith chaired, examined Mr. Shipman's crimes. The inquiry identified 218 victims and estimated his total victim count at 250, about 80% of whom were elderly women. Mr. Shipman's youngest confirmed victim was a 41-year-old man, although suspicion arose that he had killed the patients as young as 4. Mr. Shipman is the only British doctor to have been found guilty of murdering his patients, although other doctors have been acquitted of similar crimes or convicted on lesser charges. Harold Frederick Shipman was born on the 14th of January 1946 on the Bestwood Council estate in Nottingham, Nottinghamshire. Mr. Shipman, second of 3 children of Harold Frederick Shipman Sr., born on the 12th of May 1914, and died on the 5th of January 1985, a truck driver, and Veron Britton, born on the 23rd of December 1919 and died on the 21st of June 1963. Mr. Shipman's working class parents were devout Methodists. When growing up, Mr. Shipman was an accomplished rugby player in youth leagues. Mr. Shipman passed his 11 plus in 1957, moving to High Pavement Grammar School, Nottingham, which later he left in 1964. Mr. Shipman excelled as a distance runner and in his final years at school served as vice captain of the athletics team. Mr. Shipman was particularly close to his mother, Vera, who died of lung cancer when Harold was just 17. Harold's mother's death came in a manner similar to what later became Mr. Shipman's own MO. In later stages of her disease, she had morphine administered at home by a doctor. Mr. Shipman witnessed his mother's pain subside despite her terminal condition until her death on the 21st of June 1963. On the 5th of November 1966, Mr. Shipman married Primrose May Oxterby. The couple had 4 children. Mr. Shipman studied medicine at Leeds School of Medicine, University of Leeds, graduating in 1970. Mr. Shipman began working at Pontefract General Infirmary in Pontefract, West Riding of Yorkshire, and in 1974 took his first position as a general practitioner at the Abraham Ormerod Medical Centre in Todmorden. In the following year, Mr. Shipman was caught forging prescriptions of pethidine for his own use. Mr. Shipman was fined £600 and briefly attended a drug rehabilitation clinic in York. Mr. Shipman became a GP at a Donnybrook Medical Centre in Hyde, near Manchester in 1977. Mr. Shipman continued working as a GP in Hyde throughout the 1980s and established his own surgery at 21 Market Street in 1993, becoming a respected member of the community. In 1983, Mr. Shipman was interviewed in an edition of Granada television documentary World in Action on how the mentally ill should be treated in the community. A year after Mr. Shipman's conviction, the interview was rebroadcast on Tonight with Trevor McDonald. In March 1998, Linda Reynolds of Bruck Surgery in Hyde expressed concerns to John Pollard, the coroner of the South Manchester district, about the high death rate among Mr. Shipman's patients. In particular, she was concerned about a large number of cremation forms for elderly women that Mr. Shipman had needed to be countersigned. Police were unable to find sufficient evidence to bring charges and close the investigation on the 17th of April. The Shipman Inquiry later blamed the Greater Manchester Police for assigning inexperienced officers to the case. After the investigation was closed, Mr. Shipman went to kill on 3 more people. In August, taxi driver John Shaw told the police that he suspected Mr. Shipman of murdering 21 patients. John Shaw became suspicious of many of the elderly customers Mr. Shipman took to the hospital, who seemed to be in good health but died under Shipman's care. Mr. Shipman's last victim was Kathleen Grundy, who was found dead at her home on the 24th of June 1998. Mr. Shipman was the last person to see her alive, and he later signed Mrs. Grundy's death certificate recording the cause of death as old age. Mrs. Grundy's daughter, lawyer Angela Woodruff, became concerned when solicitor Brian Burgess informed her that a will had been made, apparently by her mother, which was raised doubts about its authenticity. The will excluded Angela Woodruff and her children but left £386,000 to Mr. Shipman. At Burgess's urging, Mrs. Woodruff went to the police, who began an investigation. Miss Grundy's body was exhumed and found to contain traces of diamorphine, often used for pain control in terminal cancer patients. Mr. Shipman claimed that Miss Grundy had been an addict and showed them comments he had written to that effect in his computerized medical journal. However, examination on his computer showed that they were written after her death. Mr. Shipman was arrested on the 7th of September 1998 and was found to own a Brother typewriter, that kind used to make the forged will. Prescription for Murder, a 2000s book by journalist Brian Whittle and Jean Ritchie, suggested that Mr. Shipman forged the will either because he wanted to be caught, or because his life was out of control, or even because he planned to retire at 55 and leave the UK with his small fortune. The police investigated over other deaths Mr. Shipman had certified and investigated 15 specimen cases. The police discovered a pattern of his administering lethal doses of diamorphine, signing patients' death certificates, and then falsifying medical records to indicate that they had been in poor health. In 2003, David Spogelhalter et al. Suggested that statistical monitoring could have led to an alarm being raised at the end of 1996, when there was 67 excess deaths in females aged over 65 years, compared with 119 by 1998. Harold Shipman's trial began at Preston Crown Court on the 5th of October 1999. Mr. Shipman was charged with 15 murders of women by lethal injection of diamorphine, all between 1995 and 1998. Mr. Shipman's legal representatives tried unsuccessfully to have Mrs. Grundy's case tried separately from the others, as a motive was shown by the allegedly forged of Mrs. Grundy's will. On the 31st of January 2000, after 6 days of deliberation, the jury found Mr. Shipman guilty of 15 counts of murder and 1 count of forgery. Mr. Justice Forbay subsequently sentenced Mr. Shipman to life imprisonment on all 15 counts of murder, with a recommendation that he never be released, to be served concurrently with the sentence of 4 years for forging Mrs. Grundy's will. On the 11th of February, 10 days after his conviction, Mr. Shipman was struck off by the General Medical Council. 2 years later, Home Secretary David Blunkett confirmed the judge's whole life tariff, just months before the British government ministers lost their power to set minimum terms for prisoners. While authorities could have brought many additional charges, they concluded that a fair hearing would be impossible in view of the enormous publicity surrounding the original trial. Furthermore, the 15 life sentences already handed down rendered further litigation unnecessary. Mr. Shipman became friends with fellow serial killer Peter Moore while incarcerated. Mr. Shipman consistently denied his guilt, disputing the scientific evidence against him, and he was never made any public statements about his actions. Mr. Shipman's wife, Primrose, steadfastly maintained her husband's innocence even after his conviction. Harold Shipman is the only doctor in the history of British medicine found guilty of murdering his patients, giving him the nickname the Angel of Death. John Bodkin Adams was charged in 1957 with murdering a patient, amid rumours he had killed dozens more over a 10-year period, and possibly provided the role model for Mr. Shipman. However, John Adams was acquitted of those rumours. Historian Pamela Cullen has argued that because of Mr. Adams's acquittal, there was no impetus to examine the flaws in the British legal system until Mr. Shipman's case was brought to light. Harold Shipman hung himself in his cell at HM Prison Wakefield at 6:20 a.m. on the 13th of January 2004, the eve of his 58th birthday, and was pronounced dead at 8:20 a.m. by prison staff. A statement from Her Majesty's Prison Service indicated that Mr. Shipman had hanged himself from the window bars of his cell using bedsheets. After Mr. Shipman's death, his body was taken to the mortuary at the Medico Legal Centre for a post-mortem examination. The West Yorkshire coroner David Hinchliffe eventually released Mr. Shipman's body to the family after an inquest was opened and adjourned shortly after. Some of the victims' families said they felt cheated, as Mr. Shipman's suicide meant they would never have the satisfaction of his confession, nor answers as to why he committed his crimes. Home Secretary David Blunkett said the celebration was tempting. You wake up and you receive a call telling you Mr. Shipman has topped himself, and you think, is it too early to open a bottle? And then you discover that everybody's very upset that he's done it. Mr. Shipman's death divided national newspapers, with the likes of the Daily Mirror branding him a cold coward and condemning the prison service for allowing him to commit suicide. However, the likes of The Sun ran a celebratory front page headline, "Ship, ship, hooray." The Independent called for the inquiry into Mr. Shipman's suicide to look more widely at the state of the UK prisons, as well as the welfare of its inmates. And lastly, in The Guardian, an article by General Sir David Ramsbotham, who was formerly served as Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Prisons, suggested that the whole life sentencing be replaced by indefinite sentencing, for this would at least give prisoners the hope of eventual release and reduce the risk of their ending own lives by suicide, as well as making their management easier for the prison officials. Mr. Shipman's motive for suicide was never established, though he reportedly told his probation officer that he was considering suicide to assure his wife's financial security, after he was stripped of his National Health Service pension. Primrose Shipman received a full NHS pension she would not have been entitled to if Harold Shipman had lived past 60 years old. Additionally, there was evidence that Primrose, who had consistently protested Mr. Shipman's innocence despite the overwhelming evidence, had begun to suspect his guilt. Mr. Shipman refused to take part in the courses that would have encouraged acknowledgement of his crimes, leading to the temporary removal of privileges, including the opportunity to telephone his wife, Primrose. During this period, according to Mr. Shipman's cellmate, he received a letter from Primrose begging him to tell me everything, no matter what. A 2005 inquiry found that Mr. Shipman's suicide could not have been predicted or prevented, but that procedures should nonetheless be re-examined. After Mr. Shipman's body was released to the family, it remained in Sheffield for more than a year, despite multiple false reports about his funeral. Mr. Shipman's widow, Primrose, was advised by police against burying her husband in case the grave was attacked. Harold Shipman was eventually cremated on the 19th of March 2005 at Hutcliffe Wood Crematorium. The cremation took place outside normal hours to maintain secrecy and attended only by Primrose and their 4 children. In January 2001, Chris Gregg, a senior West Yorkshire police detective, was selected to lead an investigation into 22 of the West Yorkshire deaths. Following this, the Shipman inquiry submitted in July 2002 concluded that he had killed at least 218 of his patients between 1975 and 1998, during which time Mr. Shipman practiced in Todmorden from 1974 to 1975, and from Hyde from 1977 to 1988. Dame Janet Smith, the judge who submitted the report, admitted that many more deaths of a suspicious nature could not be definitely attributed to Mr. Shipman. Most of Mr. Shipman's victims were elderly women in good health. The judge, Dame Janet Smith's 6th and final report, issued on the 24th of January 2005. Dame Smith reported that she believed that Mr. Shipman had killed 3 patients, and she had serious suspicions about 4 further deaths, including that of a 4-year-old girl during the early stage of Mr. Shipman's medical career at Pontefract General Infirmary. In total, 459 people died while under Mr. Shipman's care between 1971 and 1998, but it is uncertain how many of those were murder victims, as Mr. Shipman was often the only doctor to certify a death. Judge Dame Smith's entire estimate of Mr. Shipman's total victim count over the 27-year period was 250. The GMC charged 6 doctors who signed cremation forms for Mr. Shipman's victims with misconduct, claiming they should have noticed a pattern between Mr. Shipman's home visits and his patients' deaths. All these doctors were found not guilty. In October 2005, a similar hearing was held against 2 doctors who worked at Tameside General Hospital in 1994, who failed to detect that Mr. Shipman had deliberately administered a grossly excessive dose of morphine to a patient. The Shipman inquiry recommended changes to the structure of the GMC. In late 2005, it came to light that Mr. Shipman may have stolen jewellery from his victims. In 1998, police had seized over £10,000 worth of jewellery that they found in Mr. Shipman's garage. In March 2005, when Primrose was asked for its return, police wrote to the families of Mr. Shipman's victims asking them to identify the jewellery. Unidentified items were handed to the Assets Recovery Agency in May. The investigation ended in August. Authorities returned 66 pieces to Primrose and auctioned 33 pieces that she confirmed did not belong to her. Proceeds of the auction went to Tameside Victim Support. The only piece of jewellery returned to a murdered patient's family was a platinum diamond ring, for which the family provided a photograph as proof of ownership. A memorial garden to Mr. Shipman's victims, called the Garden of Tranquility, opened in Hyde Park, Hyde, on the 30th of July 2005. As early as 2009, families of over 200 of the victims of Mr. Shipman were still seeking compensation for the loss of their relatives. In September 2009, letters Mr. Shipman wrote in prison to friends were to be sold at auction, but following complaints from victims' relatives and the media, the sale was withdrawn. The Shipman case and a series of recommendations in the Shipman Inquiry report led to changes to the standard medical procedures in the UK, which is now referred to as the Shipman effect. Many doctors reported changes in their dispensing practices, and reluctance to risk over-prescribing pain medication may have led to under-prescribing. Death certification practices were altered as well. Perhaps the largest change was the movement from single doctor general practices to multiple doctor general practices. This was not a direct recommendation, but rather because the report stated that there was not enough safeguarding and monitoring of doctors' decisions for their patient. The forms needed for cremation in England and Wales have had their questions altered as a direct result of Mr. Shipman's case. As an example, the persons or persons organising the funeral must answer, do you know or suspect that the death of the person who has died was violent or unnatural? Do you consider that there should be any further examination of the remains of the person who has died? Harold and Fred, They Make Ladies Dead, was a cartoon strip in 2001, issue of Viz Comic, featuring serial killer Fred West and Harold Shipman. Some relatives of Mr. Shipman's victim voiced anger at the cartoon. Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, an ITV television dramatisation of the case, was broadcast in 2002. It starred James Bolam in the title role. A documentary also titled Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, with new witnesses' testimony about the serial killer, was shown by ITV as part of its Crime and Punishment strand on the 26th of April 2018. The programme was criticised as offering little to no new insight. A play titled Beyond Belief, Scenes from the Shipman Inquiry, written by Dennis Wolfe and directed by Chris Honer, was performed at the Library Theatre in Manchester from the 20th of October to the 22nd of November 2004. The script of the play comprised edited verbatim extracts from the Shipman Inquiry, spoken by actors playing the witnesses and lawyers at the inquiry. This provided a stark narrative that focused more on personal tragedies. A BBC drama documentary entitled Harold Shipman and starring Ian Brooker in the title role was broadcast in April 2014. The satirical artist Cold War Steve regularly features Harold Shipman in his work. The Shipman Files, a very British crime story, a 3-part documentary by Chris Wilson, was broadcast on BBC Two and focused on the victims and how he went undetected for so long. Podcast episode Catching a Killer Doctor from the Cautionary Tales with Tim Harford podcast series featuring the story of Harold Shipman and how it could have been detected much earlier with good statistical models. So what are your thoughts about Mr. Shipman, aka